Hello, and welcome to the channel. Welcome to the first podcast. This is something that I didn't think I'd be doing on the channel, to be honest. This was going to be a live stream, of course. I did put a community post out the other day to say that this would be. The only thing is, I've developed a really bad cough, and we've actually had a positive test in the household, so I'm hoping it's not that. I did take a test earlier today, and it came back negative, but who knows? So let's see if we'll see how that goes. But I wanted to put something out this week. It's been an absolutely manic week for me, so I've not really had a lot of time to actually sit down and research a case. And so I was thinking, like, what can I do that is a bit Halloween-y type, but also keeping the content regular? And then it dawned on me that I had this book that I actually bought some time ago, but I haven't actually had the time to read through. This is actually a book that I got called The World's 20 Worst Crimes, and it's by Kate Kray. Now, for those who don't know, Kate Kray was actually the wife of Ronnie Kray, I believe from 1989 to 1994. So in terms of, covering crime, the way that you or I would, get into it, I kind of think that she's probably an authority figure on this in this topic. And the book itself covers some of the worst sort of true crime stories out there and her research into it. Just a quick disclaimer, this isn't any sort of paid advertisement or anything like that. This is just a book that I bought a while ago. A couple of cases in here I've actually already covered. You've got the Plainfield Butcher, which was, of course, Ed Gein, as some might know. And I've got, well, of course, the Yorkshire Ripper as well, none other than Peter Sutcliffe. So yeah, she's gone into depth with those two cases as well. But I really wanted to read some of this to you guys as well. Now, I'm sure you can probably find this. I'll leave a link in the description as well. Again, no affiliations or anything like that if you're interested in picking up this case, because there's 20 cases in this book. But I'm going to be going through one of them. And the case that I'll be essentially reading from the book directly is actually a story or a case about the Candyman. Now, given that it's Halloween season, what better topic to discuss than the Candyman? I was going to do like a Q&A section as well. In the community post that I put out the other day, I did say, drop a question in there if you had any. I did have one. How many ghosts does it take to change a light bulb? That was from Mima, of course. I know the answer to that. Actually, I do. It's they don't need to because they've already seen the light. You can tell I'm a dad, can't you? So yeah, I was also going to talk about the death of Sir David Amis as well on the channel, but again, just this week has been manic, so I didn't have time to really sort of deep dive what's happened. But obviously, thoughts and condolences go out to the friends and family of his. I think, regardless of what your political leanings are, I don't think it takes a virtuous person to say that you shouldn't be resorting to sort of violent extremes to essentially, get your point across. It's a tragic event, and it's a stark reminder of, was it 5 years ago now that Jo Cox herself was murdered. The police, from what I do know, they are treating this as a terrorist incident, and that they obviously have caught the suspect, and it appears to be terror related. But I'm not really going to go into it too much at this stage, just purely because of the fact that there's not really a lot of information out there at the moment to the public, and I think it would be improper of me to do so at the moment. So this is really just going to be a reading, and normal business will resume. And if you like sort of podcast type content, then, consider giving the video a like, letting me know in the comment section below. If there's anything you want me to talk about on a podcast format, either on my own or with a guest perhaps, let me know. I've always been interested in the idea of doing podcasts. And of course, we've done a few live streams here in the past. And I thought, if we could do something like this, perhaps something audience related, like something that the audience suggests, then yeah, I'll be well up for it. But yeah, so We're here to talk about Kate Kray's book, The World's 20th Worst Crimes. And the story, as I said, is The Candyman. And this is all her research. I've done none of it. It's quite lazy on my part, but I just wanted to share this with you. If you're interested, then, pick up a copy and you can have a look at the other 19 stories in there as well. So The Candyman. So there's a little sort of biography at the beginning. So the name is Dean Corll, and his date of birth was the 24th of December, 1939. He was from Houston, Texas, in the United States. Now, the type of murderer that he was a homosexual predator. And the body count, according to Kate, was 27 plus victims. His sentence, well, he never lived to stand trial. And I won't give it away as to why, but that will be revealed, I'm sure. There's a quote in here as well. I'm going to kill you all, but first I'm going to have my fun. And that was from Dean Corll. Let's begin. Wednesday, 8th of August, 1973, looked like being a particularly hot day in Houston, Texas. As early as 8 a.m., Velma Lyons, chief telephone operator in the Pasadena Police Department, was glad to walk out of the heat into the air-conditioned police headquarters. She'd been seated in front of the switchboard for only a couple of minutes when a call came through. A boyish voice with a broad Texan accent said, "Y'all better come down here now. I just killed a man." The caller gave the address as 2020 Lamar Drive. Within a couple of minutes, 2 squad cars were on their way. Lamar Drive was in a middle-class section of Pasadena, a small nondescript wooden bungalow with an overgrown lawn and a broken fence. Three teenagers, 2 boys and a girl, were sitting on the step by the front door. The girl's clothes were torn to shreds and looked as though she had been mauled by a grizzly bear. All 3 were red-eyed, as if they'd been crying. A skinny, pimply youth with a wispy blonde moustache said he had made the phone call. He pointed at the front door and said, "He's in there." Lying against the wall of the corridor was the naked body of a well-built man. His face was caked with blood from a bullet wound. There were more bullet holes in his back and shoulder. He was obviously dead. The teenagers gave their names as Elmer Wayne Henley, Timothy Curley, and Rhonda Williams. Elmer Henley, or Wayne as he liked to be called, was the boy who had made the call. He explained that he had shot his friend, whose name was Dean Corll. The bedraggled teenagers were driven to the Pasadena police headquarters and an ambulance summoned to take the corpse to the morgue, while detectives began to search the house. It was obvious from the state of the place that Dean had moved in recently. Half-empty boxes were strewn about the house. Furniture was wrapped in plastic and decorating material lay in the hallway. Detectives carefully made their way through the corridor, trying not to breathe too deeply, as a strong smell of acrylic paint made them quite giddy. The bedroom close to where the body was lying contained only a single bed and a small table. The room was dominated by a huge poster of a Jesus-like face and the caption, "Love." The carpet was covered with transparent plastic sheeting. Beside the bed was an 8-foot-long piece of plywood with handcuffs attached to 2 of its corners and nylon ropes attached to the other 2. A long hunting knife in its scabbard lay nearby. A black box contained a 17-inch long dildo and a huge tube of lubricant. The sinister props clearly pointed to sadistic sexual practices. The seasoned detectives shook their heads in disbelief, a look of horror frozen on their craggy faces. The new Ford van parked in the drive gave the same impression. It had heavy navy blue curtains, which could be drawn to block out the back windows. A piece of carpeting covered the floor and rings and hooks were attached to the walls. There were also several rolls of nylon rope. In a large box covered with a piece of carpet, the police found strands of human hair. Another similar box had air holes drilled into its sides. Back at the police station, Elmer Wayne Henley was explaining how he had come to shoot his friend, Dean Corll. He was nervous and chain-smoked while he made his harrowing statement. He had met Corll, he said, when both he and Corll lived in a rundown area of Houston known as the Heights. Corll, who was 16 years older than him, had only recently moved into the house in Pasadena. On the previous evening, Henley and Timothy Curley had been invited to a paint-sniffing party at Corll's house. Around midnight, the two boys left to buy beer and cigarettes, promising not to be long. When they returned, they had a friend with them, Rhonda Williams. She had decided on the spur of the moment to run away from home. Rhonda had been in a terrible state and had been totally miserable ever since her boyfriend had vanished a year before. A little after midnight, she met Wayne and Timothy at the liquor store, and when they invited her to the paint-sniffing party, she readily accepted. Corll was furious when the two boys arrived back at the house with Rhonda in tow. "You weren't supposed to bring a girl," he yelled. "Now you've spoiled everything." But after a while he calmed down and seemed to be in a better mood. The four of them settled down to a paint-sniffing session in the living room. Acrylic paint was sprayed into a paper bag and passed around so they could all breathe in the fumes. Within an hour, all four were stretched out unconscious on the floor. When Wayne came around, daylight was filtering through the drawn curtains. He realised with a jerk that Corll was snapping handcuffs on his wrists. His ankles were already tied together. The other two were also cuffed and bound, and Timothy had been stripped. As they began to recover their senses, they started struggling to get free. It was clear that Corll's good humour of a couple of hours earlier had been an act. He was seething with resentment, raving like a rabid dog. He waved a knife at them and told them he was going to kill them all. "First, I'm going to have my fun." Then he dragged Wayne into the kitchen and pushed a .22 pistol against his belly. Wayne panicked, but then quickly decided that his only chance of escape was to sweet-talk Corll and persuade him that he'd be willing to join him in murdering Rhonda and Timothy. It took some time, but finally Corll removed the handcuffs and untied Wayne's feet. It was agreed that Wayne would rape Rhonda while Corll raped Timothy. Wow. Whew. Corll carried Timothy and then Rhonda into the bedroom. He turned the radio on high to drown any screaming. Corll placed the pistol on the bedside table and began to undress. He handed Wayne the knife and ordered him to cut off Rhonda's clothes. The girl, still dazed from the paint fumes, was only half aware of what was happening. Knowing that Corll was watching him closely, he began to cut away Rhonda's clothing. Meanwhile, Timothy was struggling desperately, trying to push Corll off him. Wayne shouted above the music, "Why don't you let me take her out of here? She doesn't want to see what you were doing." Corll ignored him. He was far too busy abusing Timothy. Wayne saw his chance, jumped to his feet and grabbed the pistol. "Back off, Dean," he yelled above the radio. "Stop it!" Corll lurched to his feet, wide-eyed with rage. "Go on, Wayne. Kill me. Why don't you?" he screamed. As Corll got closer and closer, he shouted louder and louder. Go on. Go on. Be a man. Pull the trigger." Elmer Wayne Henley had a little smirk on his face and a big grin inside as he fired the gun. The first bullet struck Corll in the head and he staggered a couple of paces, a look of surprise on his face as he clutched his head. "What?" Wayne stepped forward, raised the gun and fired another shot into his shoulder. Corll fell through the door and hit the wall of the corridor. There was no stopping Wayne. With his legs spread apart and both hands gripping the gun, he emptied the rest of the bullets into Corll's back. The dying man fell as if he had been filleted, his body slithering down slowly to the floor until he lay with his cheek and shoulders against the wall. Wayne quickly found the handcuff keys and released his two friends. Rhonda was struggling to take in what had happened, but when she saw Corll lying in a pool of blood, she began to scream. Wayne calmed her down, and they all dressed, Rhonda making do with her slashed clothes. They discussed what to do next. Neighbours had probably seen them entering the house, and so could identify them. And the corpse was bound to be discovered sooner or later. If they fled now, it would be unlikely that their version of events would be believed. Wayne dialed 911, and his call was put through to the Pasadena Police Department. Still in shock, all three were unable to stop sobbing. It took Wayne Henley an hour and a half to make his statement. Rhonda and Timothy were also questioned. Timothy mentioned something that the police found very interesting. While we were waiting for the police, Wayne told me that if I hadn't been his friend, he could have got $1,500 for me. Questioned about what Timothy had said, and the plywood and the dildo, Henley told the police that Corll liked to use them to abuse young boys and had been paying Henley to find them. Why then did Henley decide to kill Corll? He made one mistake, said Henley. He told me that I wouldn't be the first one he killed. He said that he'd already killed a lot of boys and had buried them in a boat shed. The detectives interrogating Henley glanced at each other. So far they had assumed that they were dealing with a case of drug abuse and sexual perversion, and that Corll's threats to kill the teenagers had been intended merely to frighten them. Henley's words raised a far more unpleasant suspicion. For nearly 3 years, boys had been disappearing from the Heights. The police had registered them as a matter of course as runaways, but many parents claimed that their sons had disappeared too abruptly for this to be the case. The police were aware that Corll had lived in the Heights just before moving to Pasadena, and he lived opposite one of the missing boys. "Where is this boat shed?" one of the detectives asked softly. Henley said he had only been there once, but it was somewhere in southwest Houston. He was able to recollect 3 of the names that Corll had mentioned: Marty Jones, Charlie Corll, and David Hilgiest. All 3 boys were listed as missing. It was more likely that Henley was still stoned from the acrylic paint he had been sniffing the night before, but his claims had to be checked out. Detectives asked Henley, "Can you remember how to get to this boat shed?" "I think so. It's near Hiram Clark Road." "Okay, let's go." Henley was transferred to Houston Police Headquarters, where he was shown pictures of 2 boys who had been missing since the 27th of July, 13 days before. Henley identified them as Charlie Corll, 17, and Marty Jones, 18. 2 of the boys Corll claimed to have killed. The Houston-Pasadena detectives, now accompanied by 2 of their Houston colleagues, headed south to Hiram Clark Road. Another group of detectives were ordered to gather diggers, spades and ropes and meet them there. It was already late in the afternoon when 2 cars arrived at the rendezvous. From here, Henley took over the navigating, chain-smoking and chattering non-stop, pointing at this and that, and umming and ahing, much to the annoyance of the sheriffs. Eventually they pulled up beside a barbed wire fence on Silver Bell Street, and Henley pointed to a row of corrugated iron sheds standing well back from the road. "That's it," he said, pointing. "That's it." Southwest Boat Storage consisted of 20 roofed sheds, mostly used to house boats. The police drove into the compound, and Henley directed them to shed number 11. The double doors were padlocked, and the owner of the complex, a Mrs. Menier, who lived in a large house next to the compound, told them detectives that she didn't have a key. "Renters provide their own padlocks," she told them. When the police explained that the man who rented shed number 11 was dead, however, she gave them permission to break in. Inside was a half-dismantled car, a child's bicycle, and a large iron drum, along with some cardboard boxes, water containers, and ominously, 2 sacks of lime. The earth floor was covered by 2 long strips of old carpet and a large plastic bag containing a collection of men's clothing. The place was stifling hot, like a baker's oven. Wayne Henley stood at the door, nervously peering inside. He knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. Slowly, he walked back towards the cars, sat down on the ground, and buried his head between his knees. The first task was to move everything out of the shed. While this was being done, a detective noted the registration numbers on the car and bicycle and radioed the information back to police headquarters. It was soon established that the car had been stolen from a used car lot, and the bicycle belonged to a 13-year-old boy named James Dremala, who had vanished less than a week before. Once the shed was empty, the 2 strips of carpet were rolled up. The detectives looked around for a good point to start digging. They chose a place where the earth seemed softer. 2 trusted convicts, who had been brought along from the local jail, were ordered to begin digging. Even with the doors open, the heat was unbearable. Both men were soon sweating heavily. 6 inches down in the sandy earth, they uncovered a white substance. "That's lime," said the detective. "Keep digging." Suddenly, the shed was filled with a sickening stench. The detectives held their noses. One of the convicts carefully removed another shovel full of earth. There, staring up at him, was a boy's face. The convict dropped his spade and rushed outside, heaving and retching. The sheriff picked up the spade and carefully went on with the job himself. Minutes later, the boy found themselves looking down at the body of a boy. He looked about 12 or 13 and was naked. The boy had probably only been in the ground a couple of days. Jesus. One of the detectives immediately radioed police headquarters and requested a team of forensic experts. A second body was soon discovered. As it began to grow dark, a fire engine with floodlights and 2 air extractors were brought in. The bodies of 2 more young boys were uncovered. One youth had been shot in the head, and the other strangled with the cord from a set of Venetian blinds that was still knotted around his throat. At 10 p.m, a silent and ashen-faced Henley was driven back to the police station. 2 hours later, the body count had risen to 8. The men digging were exhausted, and it was decided to stop for the night and resume work in the morning. At 10 a.m. the next morning, after a visit from his mother, Wayne Henley was again sitting opposite a detective in the Pasadena Police's interview room. "Tell me about the boys you procured," the detective began. Henley explained that he had first met Dean Corll 2 years earlier, while Dean was working at a candy factory. Dean had offered him $200 for every young boy he could bring along. Right, I'm just going to stop there. This kind of thing has happened before. There are other cases where people coerce other people to bring them their victims. There is one case, is it the Stainer? The Stainer boy? Wasn't he? He was coerced, I think, by another lad and then was taken away by his captor and was held captive for 7 years. I mean, that's a really tragic story, that one. But yeah, this isn't the first time I've come across someone basically like a criminal saying, "All right, here's some money," to normally a young boy or something, and go and find me a victim. I just don't understand the logic in terms of how people can just justify doing something like that. Because, I mean, come on, they're not going to be doing something nice with these people. You know what I mean? This is, man. At this point, Henley made a very significant admission that he had been present when Dean Corll had killed some of the boys. This changed the whole situation. Until then, the police assumed that they were dealing with an insatiable homosexual rapist and a youth who he had persuaded to help him procure boys. Okay, now this is even getting heavier now. Now it looked as if Elmer Wayne Henley had been an active participant in the murders. They were interrupted by a call from Houston Police Headquarters. A man named Alton Brooks had turned up at the police station with his 18-year-old son David. He explained that David had known Dean Corll and wanted to tell the police about it. David Brooks was now giving a statement that implicated Henley in the murders. When the detective hung up the phone, he told the team manager on the other side of the desk, that was the lieutenant at Houston Homicide, who says he has a kid named David Brooks there, and Brooks is making a statement about you and Dean Corll. Strangely, Henley looked relieved. Good, he said. Now I can tell you the whole story. Jesus. The detectives did their best to show no emotion during the statement that followed, but it was difficult to look impassive while Henley described how he had lured boys he had known all his life into Dean Corll's lair. What? He was luring boys he knew? Alright, it's one thing when they do it with strangers, but actual children or, friends, that's... oh my God. Mate, who needs enemies with friends like him, eh? There'd be liquor there, of course drugs. The boys would be plied with intoxicants until they could barely speak, and often they would simply pass out. When they woke up, they'd discover they were strapped and handcuffed to a 2-inch by 4-inch wooden board. Here they'd be abused, tortured, and sexually assaulted for days. Their pubic hairs were plucked out one at a time. Objects were inserted into their rectum, oh my God, and glass rods were shoved into their urethra, oh my word. And glass rods were shoved into their urethra and smashed. Oh my days. Genitals were removed, and all were sodomized. Sometimes they were strangled. Other times they were shot. Oh my God. When a victim died, his body was discarded like yesterday's newspaper, and the process of finding a new boy would begin again. This is crazy. I think I might have heard about this case before, but never in this depth. Detectives were stunned into silence. Henley was apparently an intended victim when he was taken to meet Corll in 1971. However, Dean Corll soon realised that Henley would make a good accomplice. He had lots of friends and would do anything for money. The usual method of obtaining victims was to drive around until they spotted a likely victim, and Corll would spin them a well-rehearsed line. Since there was already a teenager in the car, the boy would suspect nothing. That was how Corll had picked up 13-year-old James Dremala a couple of days before. They had been parked in front of the grocery store when the boy rode past on his bicycle. Dean Corll called him over and told him he had a lot of Coke bottles in his garage, and if the kid would like to come along, he could collect the deposits on them. So James Dremala allowed Corll to put his bicycle in the back of his van. They drove to Corll's house on Lamar Drive, where the boy was raped, tortured, and strangled. Jesus. Evil truly walks this earth, doesn't it? At this point, detectives received the latest report from the boat shed. 4 more victims had been found in the last 2 hours, bringing the total to 12. Beside one of the bodies, a set of genitals had been found in a plastic bag. It seemed that Corll did like to castrate some of his victims. Henley's confession went on for 2 more hours. It was rambling and often incoherent, but detectives gathered that Henley had been present at the murder of at least 9 boys. He admitted shooting one of them. The bullet had gone up the boy's nose and, stunned, the boy had looked at Henley and asked, "Wayne, why did you shoot me?" Henley had simply pointed the gun at the boy's head and pulled the trigger again. This time, the boy died. Jeez. Detectives wanted to know whether Corll had buried any bodies in other places beside the boat shed. Yes, Henley replied. There was some on the shores of Lake San Rayburn, and more on the beach at High Island, some miles along the coast. An hour later, Henley had led the police into the woods by the shores of Lake San Rayburn. He showed them the sites of 6 graves before darkness made further digging impossible. The latest news from the boat shed was that the parts of 17 bodies had now been found. Some of the bodies were so old that little more than bones remained. The following morning, the body count rose to 25, with the uncovering of another 2 bodies at Lake San Rayburn. By midday, a convoy of police and reporters were on their way south to High Island, where Henley insisted more victims were buried. 2 more bodies were found that afternoon, making the total 27. Later, 4 more would be uncovered on the beach. 2 others mentioned by Henley were never discovered. On Friday morning, while Elmer Wayne Henley was still at Lake San Rayburn, police back in Houston were taking a second statement from David Brooks. He gave the police a detailed account of Dean Corll's career of homicidal perversions. Though Brooks maintained that he had never taken an active part in the killings, detectives suspected that he was lying. What? Brooks was eventually convicted of participating in one of the murders. That's mad. Brooks and Corll first met in 1967 when Brooks was 12 and Corll was 30. Corll gave Brooks, whose parents were splitting up at the time, something he needed badly. Affection. Yeah, but not that kind of affection. Brooks began to see a great deal of his friend, treating Corll's apartment as his second home. It is probable that 1970 was the year that Corll committed his first murder. Jeffrey Allen Conan, a 21-year-old student at the University of Texas, Austin, disappeared on 20th of September 1970 while hitchhiking to his parents' home in Houston. He was last seen at 6 p.m. thumbing a lift. It seems likely that Corll picked him up and took him home. Jeffrey Conan's body was found 3 years later on High Island Beach. It was so decomposed that forensic scientists were unable to determine the cause of death, but they were able to establish that his body had been bound hand and foot and that Conan had probably been brutally raped. What made Corll's murderous missions so easy was the teenage drug culture of the Heights. In that poor run-down district, most of the kids were bored and discontent. The mere suggestion of a party was enough to make their eyes light up. They smoked pot when they could afford it and popped pills. Acrylic paint was the cheapest way of getting a quick high. The fact that most of the kids were permanently stoned gave another big advantage to the predatory perverts like Dean Corll, who would get his perverted kicks for a couple of dollars. Occasional disappearances in the area caused little stir because the rate of runaways from the Heights was so high. Not long after the murder of Jeffrey Conan, David Brooks walked into Corll's apartment unannounced and found Corll naked. In another room were 2 naked boys, each strapped to a plywood board. Christ. Corll demanded indignantly to know what Brooks was doing there and ordered him to leave. Later he told Brooks that he had killed both boys and offered to give him a car as a price for his silence. He made good his promise and bought Brooks a green Corvette. One unknown youth was picked up sometime in November 1970 and taken back to Corll's apartment. Corll raped and murdered the boy while Brooks looked on. What? I just can't understand it. It's just mental. The Candyman's appetite for murder was growing. Many of the boys he had befriended in the days that he worked in the candy factory, hence the nickname, now noticed that he was becoming bad-tempered and secretive and stopped calling round. On 15th of December 1970, 2 boys were enticed to an apartment that Corll had rented on Columbia Street. They were 14-year-old James Glass and his 15-year-old friend Danny Yates. Both had been to church with James, Glass's father. Glass had already been to Corll's apartment once and had taken a great liking to Corll. This time, both boys ended up on the plywood board, after which they were strangled. By this time, Corll had decided that he needed to rent somewhere closer than High Island Beach and San Rayburn to bury his bodies, and so he rented the boat shed on Silver Bell Street. The boys were buried there. Corll had enjoyed the double murder so much that he was eager to try it again. 6 weeks later, in January 1971, 2 brothers, Donald and Jerry Waldrop, aged 17 and 13, were strangled and buried in the boat shed. Brooks admitted, "I believe I was present when they were buried." On the 29th of May 1971, 13-year-old David Hilgiest disappeared on his way to the swimming pool. His friend George Winkle, aged 16, vanished the same day. Christ. Reuben Watson, 17, went to the cinema on the afternoon of the 17th of August 1971, with a couple of dollars borrowed from his grandmother. He later called his mother at work to say that he would meet her at 7:30 p.m. He never showed up. Brooks later admitted being present when Reuben was murdered. Another friend of Elmer Wayne Henley's was 14-year-old Rhonda Williams. She was a typical Heights teenager, living with a one-parent family and determined to leave home as soon as possible. Rhonda craved affection and security and thought she had found them in 18-year-old Frank, her boyfriend. He was a strong-willed young man who was saving up so they could get married as soon as possible. On the 24th of February 1972, Frank failed to return home from work and was never seen again. Oh my God, don't tell me he was killed by this man. Rhonda was shattered and indeed, over a year later, was still depressed. On the evening of the 7th of August 1973, she told Elmer Henley that she intended to run away from home that very night, and Henley took her over to Corll's house in Pasadena. On Monday, the 13th of August 1973, 5 days after the death of Dean Corll, a grand jury began to hear evidence against Henley and Brooks. The first witnesses were Rhonda Williams and Tim Curley, who had almost been Corll's latest victims. It was clear that Henley had brought Tim to Corll's house to be raped and murdered, which is why he had told Tim that he could have got $1,500 for him. When Corll had snarled, "You've spoiled everything," he had meant that the arrival of Rhonda Williams now made it impossible to murder Tim. Then it seems Corll had thought of another solution, to kill all three of them. After listening to the evidence of the various teenagers, the jury indicted Henley and Brooks on various murder charges. The trial was held in San Antonio, Texas. It began in June 1974 and ran into July. The jury rejected the insanity pleas put forward by the defense. Henley was convicted on 9 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to 6 consecutive 99-year life imprisonments, a total of 594 years in prison. Brooks was convicted on only 1 count and received only 1 term of life imprisonment. And that's that. That is horrible. That's my watch. I mean, wow. What a monster. I mean, on the one hand, the fact that he was, ended, fantastic, great job, well done there, mate. But then you also participated in 9 of these murders, and you were like taking your own friends there. That's just demented on so many levels. I mean, I couldn't even begin to imagine the mind process. Like, I get if you're doing it for money, how low can you possibly go? I mean, that's probably the lowest you can go, the most immoral way to obtain money. I mean, that's shocking. And there's another 19 stories just like this one in this book. And as I say, I'm not affiliated. This is the first one I've read. It was actually the 5th story in the of the 20, but I'm definitely going to sit down and go. I mean, if you want me to do another reading of this, let me know in the comment section below, and I'll certainly do it. But yeah, I need to go and I think I need to go and wash my eyes out now and put something funny on the telly, I think. So if you're still here, thank you very much for listening to this. And yeah, let me know if you want me to do sort of podcast type content alongside the videos that we normally do. Then let me know. Drop a comment, leave a like, share this wherever you can. And until next time, take care and goodbye. For now.